real quick intro, then we'll hop right into making a rubric of, nobody wants to make a rubric about something graded, right? So I think it teased in the intro. We're going to do a rubric about how to judge chocolate chip cookies, because that's, let's face it, far more fun. One question is we often come up with, what is a rubric? So they're used for scoring. They're set pretty defined expectations. You want to break your kind of assignments down when you make a rubric into actual learning objectives. And then the other kind of built-in thing about a rubric, it should really define what's your acceptable and unacceptable levels of doing those things. So once you have a rubric built, it speeds up grading. It also allows for consistency, and not just between graders, which is where they're often used, but also just within your own grading. If you make the rubric part of the process, you actually can get better assignments. It really gets you to think, what am I actually trying to get the students to do? Students, if they're a good rubric, like them. Again, they're fast. It speeds up grading. It means you get their work back to them faster, potentially with better comments or more useful comments. And another one that I never thought about, again, until I started reading a lot, is this leveling the playing field idea. That our students have a huge variety of backgrounds coming in. We tell them to go do a certain kind of assignment. Well, some of them that went to the best high schools and are really good at all this, they know what you're talking about, right? Then there's this other group that may have no idea what you're talking about. So if you have a good rubric that really helps and define the expectations, probably can help those students kind of get a little further along. The biggest disadvantage, maybe, is the time and effort it takes to construct them. Let's do this with the cookies. So the gist is what excuse my terrible Italian, the Buon Mercato chain of restaurants. Okay, they're not real. They want to get a new cookie. They want to replace their fancy homemade cookies with something store-bought and cheaper, right? So they want you to test cookies, store-bought cookies, to find out which cookie is just going to be great and most like a homemade chocolate chip cookie. This is where we'll make a cookie rubric as a group. Just each person, just write down, say like 3 things, each one on a different Post-it note, that you think would define a really good, like homemade, awesome chocolate chip cookie.
All right, we all have some idea of what we want in a cookie, so luckily you guys have started, like size. They should have size. I'm not sure what that means. This one put big in parentheses. That's more helpful. Big cookies you like. All right. Can taste chocolate chips. We have texture. Is that soft, hard, or is that something different? Grittiness, moistness. Okay. Looks good. What does that mean? I don't know. So you'll have to. So some of these we have to define. Is the point? It's like, yeah. What exactly does that mean? We tell the kids, I want you to write a good introduction. What does that mean? Right? We have to think about this very carefully.
Now we've brainstormed, right? We have all these things that make a good chocolate chip cookie. So now we need to come up with, real quick as a group, what are we going to call the different kind of categories these things are, which will be sort of the dimensions or the rows on our rubric. There's a lot of stuff about size. Do we have a name for that? Size. I'll go with size. I can't imagine a cookie without texture.
Or size.
Or size. How you're going to rate these cookies. What we're going to do is a 3-point scale, 3 being the highest, the best. So for texture, how are you going to define 3 different categories of texture? But one thing to avoid is stuff like good texture.
Moderate.
Right? Obviously, we've seen already that's really subjective, right? Is crispy really good texture, or is chewy really good texture?
All right, come get cookies.
Everybody come get cookies.
What we're going to do is you're going to actually then figure out how do I apply this rubric to a taste test and rank the cookies. Some of them you can assess really easy and objectively. Some you might find are unmeasurable. Some you might find you're being very subjective on. And that's very important for you to think about and notice as you're going. Because one of the things that I like to get rid of at least is as much subjectivity as possible. Because that's, the students sort of hate having to read your mind. Okay? Who got the highest score for cookie 3?
Okay, so I heard a comment here and there that your number scores didn't necessarily go with what your gut said.
Who did not like cookie 3 very much?
But it was the best one.
So your gut reaction in majority was that this was not a very good cookie, and yet the rubric scored it the highest. We had the majority of people find this the best, and the majority of people did not like this cookie. It means that the job the rubric did wasn't what we actually wanted from the start. It deviated, it accomplished something very well, but it wasn't what we expected or desired. So, and that's actually a huge problem. And so what we're trying to do with in this discussion is point out there are very common things that go wrong with rubrics and you need to watch out for. And that's a big one. Is your rubric actually assessing what you want? Because it worked. Here we came up with something very objective, but is it really easy to assess 35% chips? I wouldn't be able to personally. So given the tools at hand, we have a category that's perfectly good, but not practical. Yeah, and typically what we're all, I know I'm guilty of this because when I first started this process, we have an assignment and then we make a rubric for it. And that's what we did here. We had cookies and we applied a rubric we came up with without ever looking at the cookies, right? Ideally, what you'd want to do is make the rubric and then bake a cookie to match the rubric. So, and this is what we see is if we make a rubric of our expectations, and what I found is my students are completely incapable of matching my expectations as freshmen. I misjudged their developmental state and their status out of high school. And once I realized that, I had to go back and retool the rubric to match their level of competence. Right? And exactly what we would need to do with this is to go back and say, all right, this is not assessing commercial cookies. This is what we would want for a homemade cookie, and that's not really what we're doing. So let's go back and redo it given this experience we have. So yeah, it's tricky. And I like that it makes us think.